Mega race, very solid. Second stint was super fast. Russell P1, Antonelli P2, Charles P3, and we are P4.
Great effort, guys. Really great job. Really proud of all the work. Gracias to everyone back at the factory. Yeah, it's not the result. Solid points. Team, let's keep pushing.
Thank you, Luis. Last stint you were by far the fastest. And the first you were stuck behind Charles.
The Australian Grand Prix marked the start of a new Formula One season, and as usually happens in Melbourne, the weekend promised many answers about the true level of each team. Albert Park has always been a special circuit to open the championship, because it quickly reveals who comes prepared and who is still trying to understand their car. But this time, in addition to the battles on the track, something much more important was beginning to brew off it. From the first sessions of the weekend, there was already a strange feeling inside the paddock. Some teams were starting to notice something that didn't quite fit in the performance simulations. It wasn't simply that Mercedes was being competitive, something that in Formula One can always happen depending on the circuit. The problem was the magnitude of the difference they seemed to have at certain times, especially in straight-line speed and the ability to accelerate with an ease that the rest of the teams could not replicate. During the race, that impression began to transform into a more serious suspicion. While some teams struggled with tire degradation, pace management, or car balance, Mercedes seemed to have a reserve of power that appeared just when they needed it most. For rivals, this began to be difficult to explain solely with aerodynamics or a good setup. Lewis Hamilton was one of the drivers who was able to observe this situation closest during the race. Now, from another perspective on the grid, the Briton could directly compare the behavior of his car with that of the Mercedes around him. And what he saw on the track began to raise more questions than answers. Throughout the final laps, as the Grand Prix approached its conclusion, Hamilton began to comment on the radio about something that many engineers were surely also silently analyzing. The seven-time world champion was surprised by the difference in power that seemed to exist, an advantage that at certain times made the cars powered by Mercedes simply look like they were in another category on the grid. But what was truly striking was not just the surprise in his words. It was the moment in which Hamilton connected that difference with a possible technical detail in the engine, specifically mentioning the issue of the compression ratio within the power unit, an extremely sensitive area of the regulations that has historically been the terrain of aggressive interpretations by the teams. That comment, uttered on the team radio, had enormous weight within Formula One, because it didn't come from just any driver. It came from someone who spent more than a decade within Mercedes, who knows perfectly how that structure works and who understands the technical limits of the regulations better than almost anyone. In that moment, what seemed like a simple career conversation began to transform into something much bigger. Hamilton wasn't just expressing surprise at a rival's performance. He was implying that the advantage might come from an interpretation of the regulations that had perhaps gone too far. And in Formula One, when a world champion drops a technical suspicion on the dominant engine of the championship, the echo of those words begins to travel through the paddock long before the race is over. When the Australian Grand Prix ended, many thought that Hamilton's statements would remain a simple radio curiosity, one of those comments that appear in the midst of the tension of a complicated race. But what happened next showed that this was far from a passing comment. Within hours, the message began to spread throughout the paddock. Engineers, journalists, and teams began to analyze the British man's words more carefully. Because when a driver with Hamilton's technical knowledge and experience mentions a specific engine element, he doesn't do it by chance. The point that drew particular attention was its reference to the compression ratio of the power unit, an extremely delicate part within the technical regulations of Formula One. This area defines how energy is used within the combustion engine, and small differences in its interpretation can translate into significant power advantages. In other words, Hamilton was suggesting something very specific, that the superiority that Mercedes was showing could be related to an interpretation of the regulations in that area of the engine. And this is where the issue becomes politically explosive. Because if a team has found a way to exploit a loophole in the rules, the advantage can be enormous. But at the same time, that advantage only exists until the FIA decides to intervene with a technical clarification or a directive that closes that gray area. That's why Hamilton's words were not just a race comment. They were a kind of signal sent to the paddock. A warning that automatically forces all rival teams to start investigating exactly what is happening inside the Mercedes engine. And when that type of suspicion appears, the reaction within Formula One is usually immediate. Team engineers begin reviewing telemetry data, comparing straight-line speeds, analyzing acceleration phases, and studying any details that might reveal where the advantage comes from. Because if there is an interpretation of the regulations that allows power to be gained in this way, no one wants to be left behind. But Hamilton went even further with his message. The Briton made it clear that if the FIA is already aware of this possible technical advantage and decides to wait several races before intervening, the competitive damage could be enormous. According to his own warning, if a team maintains such a large lead for months, the championship could be practically decided before rivals have time to react. And that line was probably the most powerful part of the entire radio. Because in modern Formula One, technical development takes time. If a team begins the championship with a clear engine advantage, recovering that difference may require half a season or more. By then, the points will already be on the scoreboard and the championship may have tilted in an almost irreversible direction. So, without saying it directly, Hamilton was raising an uncomfortable question. He wasn't just pointing out a possible technical advantage. It was putting pressure on the body that regulates the sport. Because now the question is no longer just whether Mercedes has found something special in its engine. The question is much more delicate. And that's how a simple radio at the end of the Australian Grand Prix ended up becoming something much bigger than an emotional reaction after a difficult race. Lewis Hamilton's words were not only recorded in the broadcast, they began to generate a chain reaction within the Formula One paddock. Because when a driver with 7 world championships drops a technical suspicion on the team he potentially dominates, everyone begins to look in the same direction. Suddenly, the focus was no longer solely on the outcome of the race. The conversation changed completely. Engineers, analysts, and journalists began to wonder if there really is a structural difference in engine performance that is marking the hierarchy of this start of the season. Hamilton, who for years was part of Mercedes' own project, knows better than almost anyone the way that team works and how they constantly seek the limits of the technical regulations. Therefore, when the Briton mentions a possible aggressive interpretation of the engine's compression ratio, his comment does not sound like an improvised theory. It sounds like the observation of someone who fully understands where those advantages can appear within Formula One engineering. And at this point, the political dimension of the problem appears. Because if Mercedes has really found a way to take advantage of a gray area in the regulations, it doesn't necessarily mean it's illegal. In the history of Formula One, it has happened many times that teams discover ingenious solutions that comply with the letter of the regulations even if they challenge its spirit. But when those solutions create too big an advantage, pressure on the FIA becomes inevitable. That's where Hamilton's message takes on even greater weight. His words function as a kind of public warning. A way of saying that if there is a technical interpretation that is distorting the competitive balance, the regulatory body will have to act sooner or later. Meanwhile, rival teams will not sit idly by. Ferrari, Red Bull, McLaren, and the rest of the grid will begin to analyze every detail of the performance of the Mercedes engines. Every top speed, every acceleration, every telemetry data will be studied, looking for any clue that explains where this apparent superiority comes from. Because in modern Formula One, the true championship is often not decided solely on the track. It is also decided in the offices, in the interpretations of the regulations, and in the technical battles that occur behind the garages. And it all started with a few words on the radio. A radio that not only expressed surprise, but it also opened one of the first big doubts of the championship. Now the unknown remains on the table. If the advantage of the Mercedes engine is as great as Hamilton suggests, are we seeing the birth of a new technical controversy in Formula One? In the end, what happened after the Australian Grand Prix demonstrates once again why Formula One is much more than just a competition of drivers on the track. Behind every result, every overtake, and every victory, there is a technical and political battle that often defines the course of an entire season. Lewis Hamilton's radio wasn't just a moment of post-race frustration. It was a statement loaded with meaning within the context of the championship. A comment that questioned the origin of the enormous advantage that Mercedes seems to have at the start of the season, pointing directly to the possibility of an extremely aggressive interpretation of the regulations in the power unit. And when a driver with Hamilton's experience, technical knowledge, and historical weight raises such a question, the impact within the paddock is inevitable. His words become a signal that forces all teams to take a closer look at what is happening. Engineers analyzing data, rivals investigating possible regulatory loopholes, and above all, the FIA facing the pressure of having to decide if there is something that needs to be reviewed? Because that is the real question that remains open after Melbourne. If Mercedes has simply done a better technical job than the rest, then this is another example of the brilliant engineering that has always characterized Formula One. But if the advantage comes from an interpretation that pushes the limits of the regulations too much, then the conversation could quickly escalate into a political battle within the championship. Leave me in the comments what you think of all of this.